One of the things that the COVID-19 pandemic really taught us was the importance of global health. Because as we learned, right, in a global society, an outbreak in one part of the world, right, can easily move to other parts of the world in our global society. So it is important that we understand global health, what that means, how it applies to our daily life. And then in this video, I also want to talk to you about some mitigation strategies to help us have a more healthy planet with the use of vaccines. Let's get started. So we'll start with some definitions. What is global health? Well, quite literally, it is the health of the globe, right? The health of our populations in the worldwide context. As I mentioned, with globalization, we can hop on an airplane and be anywhere the next day, pretty much. So it's important that we understand health from a global perspective. So there are a few different perspectives I want to bring up that we talk about when we talk about global health. One of them is, of course, medicine. Medicine, of course, is the study of the pathology of disease, how to treat, how to cure, how to take care of sick people. And medicine is really important in the fight against people who are sick or who might be sick. So this is sort of the scientific study of that disease and pathology. Then public health is another important perspective to include because it's really all about the populations, right? It's the health of population. So we look at the population as a whole. What are the health factors? What are the benefits? What are the things that are taking away from the health? So public health, really the study of populations. And I think the third part of this is epidemiology. So this is a big word, but really it's all about studying the risk factors and the transmission of different diseases, right? So epidemiologists would study how diseases spread, what are the risk factors, how are they moving throughout populations. So it's important that we take all three of these perspectives into account when we're considering global health. So I want to talk quickly about some organizations that really focus on global health. Many of these you've probably heard of, but I just want to make sure you have a good understanding of what they do and what larger entities they're a part of. So WHO, the World Health Organization, is actually part of the United Nations, and their job is to promote health and keep the world safe. We've heard a lot about them during the COVID-19 pandemic, giving guidance on what is safe and what is the best way to maintain a healthy world. UNICEF is another United Nations organization, but it primarily focuses on children. So UNICEF, the United Nations Children's Fund, is about developmental aid to children worldwide. Then moving to the United States, you've probably heard a lot about the CDC. That's the Center for Disease Control. And they're really about the prevention and the maintaining of public health, prevention of disease in the United States, Centers for Disease Control. Red Cross, now we're moving to some non-governmental agencies. The Red Cross, you're probably very familiar, right? They go to a lot of major catastrophes around the world. Their mission is really to protect the lives and dignity of victims of war and internal violence, but you also see them being a humanitarian organization that shows up when there's sort of major catastrophes in the world. The last one I want to mention is the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, right? There's old Bill Gates. And you can certainly have your opinion of Bill Gates, lots of people do, but I will say this foundation has done more than perhaps any other to enhance healthcare and reduce extreme poverty around the globe. Their organization has provided countless amounts of food and medicine to areas of the globe who really are lacking in some of those resources. Okay, so these are just some of those organizations that you might hear about when we talk about global health. A really important thing when we're talking about global health is our ability to measure global health. So how do we measure it? There are two common ways that I want to mention: the DALY and the QALY. The DALY stands for the Disability Adjusted Life Year, DALY. And what this is basically saying is the daily corresponds to one lost year of a healthy life because of a disease. So if I'm supposed to live to be 75 and a certain disease is taking off 2 years or 2 dailies, that daily would be 2. So it's one lost year of healthy life because of a disease. So this map and scale that I'm showing here is the daily out of 100,000 for any cause. In other words, they're looking globally and they're saying any cause, really, what are the amount of days lost in these areas per 100,000? So if you notice here, right, in the United States and Canada, even down through Mexico, these are pretty small dailies, meaning that the healthcare is pretty good. We are pretty good at providing resources to people that need it. In some areas of the world, though, right, where you can see, right, this scale is much higher, right? Certain parts of Africa down here, parts of the Middle East, those daily scores are a little higher, meaning because of lack of resources or lack of money, right? Some extreme poverty in some areas, or war. There's a much higher loss of healthy life because of those things occurring. So I also put this little graphic down here to show you what they're really taking into account. So if you look at gray is healthy life, right? Throughout your life, the gray is healthy. There were times you were unhealthy, right? So every little bit of this sort of salmon color is taking away from your expected full life. So the daily score here is really just taking into account the years you live with a disability, right? So maybe you are hurt or maybe you have some disease which is keeping you from living a full life. And then, of course, years that you lost to early death. So you take those together, and that's your daily score. And that is a measurement of a loss of life because of these global health issues. Another way to measure global health is the quality adjusted life year. This includes both the quantity and quality of your life lived. And the range is from 1, meaning perfectly healthy, to 0, the opposite of perfectly healthy, which would be dead. So if you look at the scale, right, here is the quality of life score: 1, perfect health; 0, dead. So as you can see, there's 2 sort of things we're looking at, A and B. In places in the world where there is intervention, right? So there's medical procedure, there's ways to intervene in these health issues. Notice death takes a lot longer time to get there. And you get a lot more of this sort of area under the curve. You get a lot more quality of life. But if there's no intervention in a place where there's maybe not as much medicine, maybe there's not as much access to health care, you can see death is earlier without any interventions. So the daily and the quality will come up a little more as we go throughout this presentation. These are just ways we measure global health. So now I want to talk about some health topics that are of global significance. So when we're talking about global health, we need to consider these things. One of the big ones, as we learned with COVID, respiratory illnesses. These are things like tuberculosis, measles, the flu, pneumonia, COVID. Those are huge health topics in our world because often these are transmitted, right, via airborne particles, respiratory illnesses. Also, around the world, diarrheal diseases. These are illnesses that often cause extreme diarrhea. And you may say, oh, well, what's so bad about diarrhea? Well, if you think about it, diarrhea is the excretion of a lot of water in your stool. And loss of water in some populations, without access to a lot of good, clean water, can be really detrimental. So we see the most common cause of diarrheal illnesses is the rotavirus, but you can also get it from other viruses and some bacteria like E. coli. HIV/AIDS, although we have some medicine which really drastically reduces the impact of HIV/AIDS, this is still a topic of global significance. Malaria, which is caused by this Plasmodium parasite, and it's transferred, of course, by mosquitoes. You can see the little drop here. So the mosquito transmits the malaria, but what's in this blood or this transmitted fluid is really a parasite called Plasmodium. And that's actually a big issue worldwide as well. And then there's some tropical diseases. These don't get as much press, but they actually are really detrimental in some parts of the world. Leprosy is still a thing. Dengue, Chagas. All of these are some diseases that are communicable and can really affect the health of this particular population. And then the last two I want to mention are mental health and cancer. I have specific separate videos in this series that address mental health and cancer, so I'm not going to go into those in great detail in this video. Okay, so what causes these issues of global health? I'm going to focus on the communicable diseases, those diseases that we transmit from one to another, right? They're communicable, they're transmittable. And so what causes them? Well, bacteria is one big cause, right? You may remember bacteria, these single cell prokaryotes that can cause issues. We have a lot of bacteria in our gut and on our body that's harmless, but some of them are pathogenic, including the bacterium Mycobacterium tuberculosis, which, as you can see, causes TB, tuberculosis. And then viruses are a big cause of worldwide health issues. HIV has been a global pandemic for a while. And then, of course, COVID more recently, the SARS-CoV-2 virus. Fungi you don't hear a lot about, but there are some fungal diseases. Aspergillosis, which is a fungus that can get in the lungs, can cause some pretty serious issues. And then the last one is sort of a catch-all category. If it's not a bacteria, virus, or a fungus, we sort of put it in this parasite category. So Plasmodium, right, this little single-celled eukaryotes that are causing the malaria disease, as we mentioned earlier, these are just parasites that can infect the body, okay? So these are the causes. So I want to give you some specific diseases now in each category that are of worldwide significance. So TB, tuberculosis, is a big issue. And these are bacterial diseases, right? So these are living bacteria in your body. So if you get a TB infection, a tuberculosis infection, it's really going to cause some major issues in the lungs, and you can see a TB infection there in this x-ray of the lungs. So as you look at this chart right here, what you'll see is that we have the DALY, the disability adjusted life years for tuberculosis per 100,000 inhabitants. So if you look around the globe, right here in Canada and the United States, we don't really have a huge TB problem. So less than 10 out of 100,000 inhabitants will have some effect, right, of tuberculosis. But if you look over here in some other areas, specifically in Africa, then what you'll notice is roughly 3,000 per 100,000 inhabitants have a daily disability adjusted life year effect from that. So this is taking off years of life in some parts of the world. Leprosy, you may have heard of this back in biblical times, but it is still around. This is a bacterial disease. Now, you'll notice it does not affect as many people. There aren't as many people with leprosy. But it is still a problem in some parts of the world. And then pneumonias are often, some pneumonias, not all, are bacterial diseases as well that are affecting people around the world. These affect global health. Okay, so what do we do with bacterial diseases? Well, lucky for us, one of the solutions, although it's not always a cure, is to just take an antibiotic, right? If you think bio means life, so something that kills the living things or these living bacteria in your body. And you may know one of our first antibiotics was penicillin, discovered by the scientist Alexander Fleming. And this was discovered serendipitously, right? It just happened to be something that he noticed was killing bacteria. And this is one example of many antibiotics that we can use to fight bacteria. Now, what we know about antibiotics, of course, is that they're often overprescribed. And some of our diseases, some of these bacteria, are actually becoming resistant to antibiotics. So we need to continue to invest in new antibiotics as these bacteria continue to evolve and become resistant. So now let's talk about a few viral diseases. Polio, horrible disease, which can disfigure children, can disfigure adults, has some major implications with the lungs. Measles, as you can see, it's a child there. Hepatitis, there are a few different types, right? A, B, and C, all with varying conditions. Smallpox, just a nasty disease that you can see there. Chickenpox, probably a lot of people had in my generation before they had the vaccine, the varicella-zoster vaccine. And chickenpox, not super deadly, but later in life, this varicella-zoster bacteria can actually lead to shingles in adults. And then monkeypox is sort of a hot topic right now. It's actually related to smallpox, and we use the same vaccine for smallpox to deal with monkeypox. So, viruses, not living. Well, most scientists agree that these are not living, right? It's just some genetic material wrapped by a protein. So, you can't use an antibiotic, right, something that kills life, if the virus is a thing that's not living. You can't kill something that's not living. So what do? Well, again, maybe cure is not the right word, but here's a few solutions we've come up with. Vaccines, which I will talk about in more depth in a moment. Antiviral drugs, specifically the ones for HIV, antiretroviral drugs, are pretty effective. And then you've probably heard of maybe somebody taking antibody treatments or monoclonal antibody treatments. These antibodies, which we'll go over a bit more in a moment, help to attack identify disease as well, these viruses. Okay? So, speaking of vaccines, I now want to spend the rest of the video really talking about the immune system and these vaccines. Now, what is a vaccine? Basically, here's the definition: a biological preparation that gives us active, acquired immunity to a particular disease. So a lot of words there. So we're saying this is going to give us acquired immunity, something we had to acquire. We weren't born with it. And it's going to be active, hopefully, to be able to fight off a particular disease. Now, when vaccines were discovered or invented, scientists had to come up with a few different ways to combat this. So they work by actually injecting an agent that resembles the disease-causing microorganism or parts of the disease-causing microorganism. So, how we make viruses is, there's a few different ways. One, we put a weakened or killed form of the microbe, right? And killed is not a great word for viruses, but that would apply maybe to a vaccine that's a bacterial vaccine. So if you look here, right, here's a typical virus, and we can actually insert weakened viruses so that the body builds up an immune reaction to them. And so you don't get sick from the virus. It's not strong enough to make you sick, but it is strong enough so that you have an immune reaction. Other things we can do is put in specific toxins from the vaccine so your body builds up a resistance and an immune reaction. And then more modern vaccines will use parts like a protein or the genetic material alone from the vaccine to, from the virus to help your body build an immune reaction. So I'm going to go over this in a bit more detail after I talk about how vaccines work and are we sure they even work at all. So let's look. Do vaccines work? Well, here's some data. So we got some data for smallpox, polio, and measles. Let's just look at some data. So the smallpox vaccine developed by Edward Jenner, 1796, right? That's a long time ago, right? What a brilliant man to be developing this early on. So smallpox really ravaged, and this is in London, for the 1700s. Look at the percent of deaths, and this is deaths, this is not just illness, right? As much as 15-20% of the population during a certain year were being killed by smallpox. Well, the vaccine was introduced here, and then notice, as time went on, how we basically eradicated this because of these prolonged uses of the vaccine. Now, what about in the United States? Polio. Look at the spike in polio in the 50s. These are in cases, and then deaths are down here on the bottom. Jonas Salk developed that, the polio vaccine, but look, just basically polio-free, right? Now, there are still cases of polio that pop up here and there, but for the majority, we're polio-free thanks to vaccines. Same thing for measles in the U.S. If you look at the number of cases, right, these were in the hundreds of thousands, and then measles has gradually declined. And these, as you can see from these pictures, these diseases are no joke, right? So these vaccines have saved countless lives. Estimates are that I've been able to find hundreds of millions of lives have been saved due to vaccines. I think personally it's probably closer to billion or billions lives that have been saved since we started administering vaccines. Okay, so we need to know, if we're talking about vaccines, we need to understand a little bit about viruses and the immune system. So viruses, right, remember, not living, but they, since they're not living, need to use a host so that they can replicate. So what they do is they find one of your cells that they can get into, right? Our cells have these nice membranes. You see the membrane? And this is inside the cell. They have these nice membranes that keep a lot out. Well, viruses have learned to hijack the system to get into the cell. So I'm going to use a very commonly known virus, coronavirus, right? The virus that causes COVID, for my example for the rest of this. So here's the coronavirus. If you look at the structure, right, it's got the genetic material inside. On the outside, it's got these little spike proteins. These spike proteins are what actually hijack our system because they bind to these receptors. They're actually called ACE2 receptors that are on our membranes in certain cells. And that signals for the cell to let it in. It's sort of like a key that fits in a lock. And the cell's like, oh, okay, come on in. Now, these receptors evolved, right, for purposes that help our body in the angiotensin delivery system. But these little surface proteins have hijacked that. So that lets the virus in. And once it gets in, it releases some of its genome or some of its genetic material. Now, this happens to be RNA, because coronavirus is an RNA virus, not DNA. And then it immediately goes to a ribosome. And if you took a biology class, you know that ribosomes make proteins. Well, what protein is it going to make? First off, it actually makes a polymerase to make more virus, right? So this polymerase makes more genetic material, right? More RNA. And it essentially makes all of this for the virus. So this is all the RNA or the genetic material for the virus. And so, right, the genetic material for that spike protein that you see there, for the membrane of the virus. And now because all this RNA is just floating around in your cells do what they're supposed to do. They take this RNA and it goes over to the rough ER, to those little ribosomes, and on the ribosomes, it starts making the proteins to make the virus. So you can see that over time, it basically makes new virus, which are then, of course, released out of the cell and go to other cells to infect. So if you're a virus, you need to get into the cell. You need to take your genetic material and replicate it, and then you need to make the proteins, which are this outer part of the virus, so that you can continue to spread. So if we want to combat this, we really have to attack. There's several different places we can attack, but the most common way, or at least recently, is to attack these spike proteins that allow the virus into the cell to begin with. All right, so once that virus gets in your body, we just saw all about that, right? So there's the SARS-CoV-2 virus. It's coming to your body. Well, what's going to happen? Well, hopefully, if we have a strong immune system, our immune system is going to respond and attack that virus. So what happens? So the virus gets in, it replicates. Oh, there's lots of them. Oh, now you've got an infection. Not good. Okay, the body needs to spot that. And something called a macrophage or an APC, an antigen-presenting cell, will take the virus, see it's captured it, digest it, break it down, and then it will take that spike protein on the surface, the antigen, what we call it, and it will present it to our helper T cells. Helper T cells kind of do what they say, right? They help. So they alert the rest of the immune system. So this antigen presenting cell has said, oh, I've got something that's bad news. This is the antigen that I found that's foreign. body, immune system, you need to do something with it. So it presents it to the helper T cell, and then the helper T cell alerts the B cells and the other T cells. So we'll start with the B cells. B cells are what make antibodies, right? So the B cells in your body will make antibodies. Now, it has to go through something called clonal selection. It actually takes this antigen and tries to make several different types of antibodies. You see all these different antibodies right here, some yellow ones, blue, purple, whatever. That's just to signify these are different antibodies. Well, if one of those antibodies actually works well, then we'll make tons of copies. We'll clone it. And those plasma cells, these B cells, will release these antibodies. Okay, it looks like the blue one was the one that was good. It worked. And then these antibodies will now go and capture invaders. Okay, there they are. Notice how they fit the spike protein. So these will capture the invaders and then trigger these killer T cells, right, which will come and then do lots of things. So antibodies work to help draw attention, to help agglutinate all of these virus particles so that the body then can fight it off more easily, okay? So one of the keys to your body's immune response are these antibodies. So now these killer T cells are going to come and they're going to take care of these captured invaders. The problem is your immune system is not just like that, right? We need about, a week or two to really get a full response of these antibodies to fight it off. Well, at that point, many people are already very sick, okay? So how can we get an immune response without getting sick? Well, that leads us to vaccines, okay? So I want to tell you about these memory B cells that remember memory. They remember certain pathogens and then can give a rapid amplified response, right? So it's sort of like fool me once, oh, you kind of got in the body, but fool me twice, it's not going to happen because I remember you and I'm going to mount a quick defense. So if you look at this chart that I've got, on the left, we've got the concentration of antibody, and down on the bottom, on the x-axis, we have time. So your initial exposure to a virus, right, here's your exposure. Notice your antibody concentration. It takes a while, but it goes up to about there, right? We call that the primary immune response. It took us a while, but we made the antibodies to fight off that disease. Okay, then you get better, antibodies start to go down. But remember the memory. If you get a second exposure, right, you get COVID again, it shouldn't be as bad because look what happens. Look at this antibody concentration. It skyrockets. So the secondary immune response in your body really is much higher and much quicker to fight off that disease. Now, you may say, well, Herder, I don't want to get an initial exposure. I don't want to have to get COVID so that the second time I get it, it's better. Well, that comes our friend vaccines. Vaccines basically serve as your initial exposure. So they're exposing you to parts of that disease, COVID in this case, so that your body is going to have these memory B cells to remember and immediately make antibodies if it is encountered again, okay? So the vaccines provide this initial exposure so you actually don't have to get sick. So how do we make vaccines? I want to start to wrap this up by giving you just a few examples of the different strategies to make vaccines so that you can understand really what's in them and what's going on. So one strategy is to give a live attenuated vaccine. Now, again, live is a little bit of a misnomer because most viruses we don't consider to be living, but the MMR, measles, mumps, and rubella vaccine, and the chickenpox, the varicella zoster, are examples of live attenuated vaccines. So these basically kind of the virus is living, but it's been attenuated, it's been weakened, right? So it can't cause sickness, but your body will still see it and say, oh, I better mount an immune reaction to this. Another vaccine strategy, and we see this in the polio vaccine and then the nasal flu vaccine, is to do an inactivated. So it's not living, it's not actually an active virus, but your body still builds up reaction. One of the more interesting things that we've been doing is what we call a recombinant viral vector. So basically, in this case, they use the outer shell as a vector. So this outer shell is like some virus that really is not so bad, right? It hasn't caused that many problems. Your body's used to it. But they put genetic material in it from the bad virus, right? So what happens is they inject the vaccine. The body then, the genetic material, right, will be made, and the body will fight off the genetic material, but the virus isn't there to do the damage, right? It's not a bad virus. Our Ebola virus and then the COVID, Johnson & Johnson, and AstraZeneca viruses are viral vector vaccines. Another really interesting thing is, well, instead of putting the whole virus, why don't we just take these spike proteins or some of these particular proteins on a cell, or excuse me, on the virus that we know mounts a reaction, and let's just inject those, right? So some flu vaccines, the HPV, the one that prevents human papillomavirus that causes cervical cancer, these vaccines are actually subunits. So it's just part of a virus. So there's no possible way of getting the virus from just the protein, right? There's no way. Some people say, oh, I don't get vaccines because, they make me sick. No. In the cases of these newer vaccines here, it's impossible for you to be sick from that virus because they're not putting the whole virus in you. It's just these little proteins or these subunits. And then I think one of the most fascinating strategies is the most recent one that we've seen with the Moderna and Pfizer COVID vaccine. Well, where all they're actually injecting is some genetic material for part of the virus, right? So they're not even putting in a part of a virus. They're just putting in the genetic material that makes part of a virus. And so that's what I want to spend a little time showing you exactly how it works. So if you remember from biology, the process of going from DNA to messenger RNA is called transcription. And then from messenger RNA to protein is called translation, right? So our DNA and our RNA is really just the code to make the proteins in our body. Well, the same thing happens in viruses. So what happens is the Moderna and Pfizer vaccine put in messenger RNA into this lipid nanoparticle, right? So these are all lipids all around. And here's the genetic material. Now, the genetic material will not make the whole virus. It's actually just the genetic material to make the spike protein. You remember that little protein on the surface? So the genetic material is put in this particle. Well, then what happens? Okay, you get the vaccine. Because of these lipids, it goes right through the lipid membrane into the cell. Once it gets in there, this messenger RNA will go to its friend, the ribosome. Remember what ribosomes do? They make proteins. Well, what protein is it going to make? Oh, the spike protein. Remember, this is the spike protein that serves as the antigen to alert the immune system. So basically, your body has made the alert or the name tag to alert the immune system, right? So these antigens, the body sees them, then the helper T cells say, hey, you need to start making these antibodies to fight off this virus because we found part of it. So the body then will mount an immune reaction to fight off this virus, even though you didn't put any virus in you, right? So this is brilliant, and I think it's an easy way that we're going to see vaccines evolve more and more to be able to fight off some of these horrible diseases. Okay, I want to end with this. A lot of people might be hesitant to get a vaccine, and let me tell you why that is a foolish endeavor. One, what else is in a vaccine? Well, let me go over this and then tell you why these are safe. What's in a vaccine? The antigen. We just talked about that. We talked about all the different ways, right? It could be a live one. It could be just parts. It could be DNA or RNA. That we've just talked about. An adjuvant is something they put in the vaccine that is meant to spike the body's reaction. So it just sort of gives it a little stronger reaction to the antigen. It sort of alerts it. There's also some preservatives because we don't want our vaccines to be infected by fungus or bacterial. So they use like a little antibiotic preservative. This used to be something called thimerosal, which is why a lot of people claim this is something which is really bad in vaccines. It used to contain a small, very minute part of mercury, but that has not been in children's vaccines in a long time, and we rarely even use thimerosal anymore as the preservative. So there's no problem with the small trace amount, even if there was thimerosal. And then we need some stabilizers. MSG, monosodium glutamate, is also often a stabilizer to help keep the vaccine antigens in place. We need a surfactant. That's something that breaks up surface tension, like soap is a surfactant that breaks up surface tension on our skin so we can wipe things off. And then there might be some residuals from some egg protein. We make, or a lot of these companies use chicken eggs or different types of eggs to actually incubate and make these vaccines. So sometimes there's a little bit of egg protein left through the clarification process. And that, unless you are allergic to egg protein, is really not an issue. And then, of course, just some like water and things to dilute it. All right. So what else is in it? That's it, right? So I feel like I have to give you the science on this. And remember, when we are deciding on a scientific point, we don't just look at one scientist's data or this scientist or read Sally's blog. What we do is we look for scientific consensus. And I will tell you, there is overwhelming scientific consensus that vaccines are safe and effective. Okay? In fact, so much that the World Health Organization has said that vaccine hesitancy, right? It's these people who are hesitant to get vaccines, who think they cause autism or some crazy thing like that. People who are hesitant, the WHO organization has now said that's a global health threat. Hesitancy to get a vaccine is a global health threat, okay? So hopefully this video has given you some information that you need to understand global health, to understand vaccines, and to make decisions for your health and your family's health more scientifically and using facts.